letter arrived on a Thursday in the first week of March, carried up the mountain by the same supply rider who brought Caleb Marsh his flour and salt, and Caleb read it at the kitchen table while the coffee was still hot. It was from a woman in Bozeman named Eugenia Whitmore, responding to the inquiry he had placed through a Trading Post contact 6 months prior. He had asked for a wife. He had specified plainly, in writing, as was his habit, that he needed someone capable of mountain work, someone who could think without being told what to think, someone who would not find the silence of the Bitterroot Valley an affliction. He had not mentioned looks. He had not thought it necessary. Mrs. Whitmore wrote that she was pleased to accept the arrangement. She wrote that she was sending her daughter Grace, who was, she said, plain in appearance but capable enough for rough work and unlikely to find better prospects elsewhere. She added, as if in further reassurance, that Grace was strong, which would no doubt be useful given the terrain. Caleb read the letter twice. Then he set it on the table and looked at it for a moment, the way a man looks at something that has told him more than it intended to. He got up. He put more wood on the fire. He started making supper for two. If that letter already made something rise in you, subscribe to this channel right now and stay until the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to know how far this story travels tonight, because the woman described in that letter is 3 days from this cabin on a stage road that turns to mud in March, and what she finds when she gets here is going to be the first honest accounting of her worth she has ever been given in her life. Don't go anywhere. Grace Whitmore was 26 years old, and she had been the plain one for as long as she could remember, which was to say for as long as there had been a Constance to be compared to. Constance was 4 years older, and had their mother's fine features and their father's height and the particular social ease of a woman who has never had reason to doubt her welcome in a room. Grace had their father's broad frame and their grandmother's practical hands and a face that people called handsome on their generous days and said nothing about on the others. She had learned to cook before Constance because Constance had been occupied with other lessons. She had learned to mend, to keep accounts, to dress a wound, to read a land survey, to judge the weather by the color of the morning sky. She had learned these things not because anyone asked her to, but because learning useful things was what you did when your value in a room was not decorative. She was not bitter about this. She had processed her family's accounting of her the way you process a difficult climate, not with anger, because anger at a climate accomplishes nothing, but with adaptation. She dressed plainly because finery would have looked like effort. She kept her opinions to herself in company because her opinions were not what company was there to hear. She did her work, and she did it well, and she did not require anyone to say so. She had known about the arrangement before her mother told her. She had heard enough of the conversation through the kitchen door, her mother's voice, then Constance's voice saying, "Montana Mama, in March I would sooner," and then the door pulling to understand the shape of it without the details. When her mother came to her 2 days later, Grace had already decided she would go, not because she was resigned to it, not because she was the leftover daughter with nowhere else to be sent. She would go because she had spent 26 years in a house where her worth had been appraised by people who did not have the instruments for it, and a mountain in Montana was at least something new. The stage to Bitterroot Valley took 3 days and was, in the mud season of 1881, an experience she would not have described as pleasant but could describe as useful. By the second day, she understood the driver, a man named Cole, well enough to know which questions he would answer and which he would not, and she had from him the following account of Caleb Marsh. 40 years old, solitary, had worked the Marsh property since his father died 12 years prior, spoke when he had something to say and otherwise did not, was considered fair in his dealings and difficult in his expectations, and had not had a woman in that house since his mother passed. "He know what he's getting," Cole said, not unkindly, just the direct way of a man who thinks the question is obvious. Grace looked out at the mud-brown valley coming into view below the ridge. "I expect he'll form his own opinion," she said. Cole made a sound that might have been respect and let it rest. The cabin sat at the edge of a pine-dark tree line with a view of the valley below that was, even in the gray of early March, a thing that required a moment of reckoning. Grace stood on the step of the wagon and looked at it. The cabin, the barn, the cleared land between them, the mountains behind that had been there longer than the idea of any of this. And she made a decision about what her face was going to do, which was nothing in particular, and she climbed down. Caleb Marsh came out of the barn before she reached the porch. He was larger than Cole had described and quieter seeming, the way large men are sometimes quiet, as though they do not need to take up more space than their bodies already occupy. He looked at her directly, the way she had learned to recognize as the difference between a man assessing and a man simply seeing, and she returned the look without flinching because she had nothing to flinch from. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Marsh." She kept her hands at her sides. She did not apologize for herself or offer any qualifying statement about her appearance or the journey. She had decided in the wagon that she would not begin with an apology, and she intended to keep to that. He took her trunk from Cole without being asked and carried it to the house with one hand. He held the door. He had lit the lamps already. Against the gray afternoon, and the cabin was warm, the stove going properly, not recently started, which meant he had been expecting her arrival and had prepared for it, which was a thing she noted and filed in the space where she kept things that told her about a person's character before they had to speak. The kitchen table was set for two. There was a covered pot on the stove. She looked at it. "Venison stew," he said. "It's been going since morning." She turned to look at him. He was standing back from the table, not blocking her way, not performing hospitality, just present, waiting to see what she would do next in the straightforward manner of a man who expects another person to have their own responses to things. "Sit down," she said, "and I'll serve it." Something shifted in his face, not surprise exactly, but a settling, as though a thing that had been slightly uncertain had just resolved. He sat. She found the ladle on the first try, which meant the kitchen was organized on a logic she recognized, and she served the stew, and she sat across from him, and they ate. The stew was good. She said so. "My mother's recipe," he said. "More or less. The more or less is the rosemary." He looked up. "She didn't use it, or you added it?" Grace said. A pause. "Added it." "It's an improvement," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not yet fully read. It had several things in it, attention being the most prominent, and then he looked back at his bowl. "Good to know," he said. Outside, the mud-seasoned wind pressed against the north wall, and the lamps burned steady, and Grace Whitmore ate her supper in a kitchen on a Montana mountain, and felt for the first time in 26 years that the room she was sitting in had not already decided what she was worth before she entered it. The work began the following morning, not because either of them announced it, because there was work to be done, and two people present who could see it, and that was sufficient. Grace found the state of the kitchen stores in the first hour adequate but inefficiently kept, and reorganized them without comment. She found a rot in the lowest shelf of the larder in the second hour and told Caleb, who replaced the board that afternoon. She found that the window above the basin leaked cold air at the seal and stuffed it with a strip of wool from her mending kit as a temporary measure, and told him it would need caulking before next winter. She did not announce any of this as contribution. She simply did what she saw needed doing and moved to the next thing. On the third day she asked about the south field, which she had seen from the kitchen window, and which had a drainage problem visible even from that distance. Caleb walked her out to look at it. She asked 3 questions and listened to his answers, and then told him what she thought, not offered, not suggested, but stated plainly. And he listened with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, which was complete and unhurried. "That's what I figured," he said when she was done. "Then why hasn't it been fixed?" "Needed someone to look at it with me," he said simply. "I've been seeing it alone too long." She considered that. She was not sure then whether he meant the field or something else. She thought probably both. By the end of the first week she had his rhythms. When he came in, when he went out, what he took his coffee with, the particular quality of the silence when he was thinking against the quality of it when he was simply present. He was a man who used quiet as other men use conversation, which suited her precisely, because she had spent 26 years in a house full of noise that was never for her, and she had not realized until this week that silence could be companionable. He had her rhythms too. She could tell because he stopped explaining things she had already noticed and started referring to things she would notice later, as though factoring her perception into his plans. It was the most respectful thing anyone had done for her in a long time, and he did it without fanfare, which made it more respectful still. On the 9th evening he came in from the barn, and she had made the rosemary venison stew from memory, adjusted, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before he came to the table and said nothing about it, which meant he had noticed and was choosing to let the noticing stand on its own. The 14th day brought the early thaw, which brought mud, which brought a section of the east fence down into the mire. They fixed it together over the course of a wet and functional afternoon, side by side in the mud, and when it was done, Caleb looked at the repaired fence and then at Grace, who had a streak of mud along her jaw and both hands dirty to the wrist, and was studying the far post with the narrowed eye of a woman deciding whether it would hold. And he said, "You've done this before." "Once," she said. "My father's fence. I was 12. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the fence. "It'll hold," he said. She knew she had been the one to set the post. It was not until the 17th day that she found the letter. She had been looking for the deed to the south field. Caleb had mentioned it was in the box of papers in the bottom of the kitchen chest, and she had found the deed, and beneath it the letter, still in its envelope, in her mother's handwriting. Her own name was not on it. Caleb's was. She should have put it back. She read it. She read it the way you read something when you already know what it contains, but need to confirm it with your eyes before the knowledge becomes real. Plain in appearance, she knew that part. Capable enough for rough work. That part, too. It was the last line that she had not known, the one her mother had added, perhaps as a final reassurance, or perhaps simply because it was true in the only way her mother understood truth. She is not what you asked for, but she is what we have to spare. What we have to spare. Grace set the letter on the table. She sat down in the chair beside it, and she put her hands flat on the table, and she looked at the wall, and she did not make a sound, because she had learned a long time ago that sounds in that house went into the wrong ears. And even here, even now, the habit of silence held. She was still sitting there when Caleb came in. He saw the letter. He saw her face. He sat down across from her without being asked, the way he had sat that first evening. And he said nothing. She said, "How long have you had this?" "Since before you arrived." She looked at him. "And you let me come anyway. I sent Cole to meet the stage." She absorbed this. "You could have turned me back." "I could have," he said. "I didn't." She looked at the letter, then at him. Why? He was quiet for a moment, not evasive. She had learned the difference. Choosing. "Because the letter told me everything I needed to know about the people who wrote it," he said, "and nothing that was any use to me about you." He paused. "I figured I'd find out about you myself." Grace Whitmore looked at Caleb Marsh across the kitchen table on the 17th day with the letter between them, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not break, not heal, but move, the way a thing moves when it has been in the wrong position for so long that the correction feels strange before it feels right. She had been appraised by people who did not have the instruments for it. She had always known this. It was different, for the first time, to have evidence. She folded the letter. She put it back in the envelope. She put the envelope in the bottom of the chest where she had found it, and she closed the lid, and she never opened it again. The letter that arrived in June was from her mother. Grace read it at the kitchen table and set it down without showing Caleb the contents, because the contents were not his to manage. Her mother and Constance were coming to visit. They would arrive on the first Thursday of July. They were looking forward, her mother wrote, to seeing how Grace was getting on. Grace knew how her mother looked when she was looking forward to something, and how she looked when she expected to find a disappointment and wanted to be present when it arrived. She had extensive experience with both expressions. She wrote back. She said they were welcome. They arrived on a Tuesday. The stage ran a day early, and Grace was in the south field with Caleb when the hired wagon came up the road. She saw it before he did. She watched it for a moment and then said, "My mother and sister are here," in the same tone she might use to report weather. Caleb looked up from the fence post. He looked at the wagon. Then he looked at Grace with an expression that asked a question without forming one. "She wanted to see how I was getting on," Grace said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he drove the post the rest of the way and set the mallet down and walked with her back to the house. Eugenia Whitmore stepped down from the wagon with the particular composure of a woman who has rehearsed her reaction in advance. She looked at the cabin. She looked at the cleared fields. She looked at Grace. Mud on her boots, hands capable and unhesitating, and Grace watched her mother perform a rapid revision of whatever she had arrived expecting to find. Constance came down behind her, prettier than Grace had ever been and knew it, and looked at the property with the assessing eye of someone who had declined this arrangement. and was now calculating whether she had made an error. She looked at the cleared south field. She looked at the barn, solid and recently rechinked. She looked at Grace in her work clothes with her capable hands and her direct posture, and Grace watched her sister do the mathematics of it in real time and arrive at an answer she had not expected. "Grace," her mother said. "You look well," Grace said. "I look well." She did not make it a question. Her mother blinked. Caleb Marsh stepped forward. He shook Eugenia Whitmore's hand. He was polite, direct, and brief the way he was with everything. Then he turned to Grace with the deliberate quality of a man who has decided something is going to be said, and is going to say it plainly, in front of whoever is present, which is the only way it means anything. "The south fence post is set," he said. "The one you braced." He said it to her directly, looking at her face. "It's the strongest one on the line." It was, to the outside ear, a statement about a fence post. Eugenia Whitmore heard it correctly. Grace saw that in her mother's face, the faint, involuntary shift of a woman who has just understood that the joke did not land where she aimed it, that she sent her spare daughter to a rough mountain, and the rough mountain received her, as though she were the only thing it had been waiting for. Constance looked at Caleb Marsh, then at her sister, then at the cleared field, and said nothing. There was nothing that would have improved her position, and she was at least perceptive enough to know it. Caleb looked at neither of them. "Come inside," he said. "Grace made the bread this morning." They ate. The bread was good, which was not the point but was not irrelevant either, because the bread was the product of hands that had spent 26 years becoming exactly capable enough to make it, and the table was set with the particular rightness of a kitchen that is being properly kept by two people who understand each other's logic, and the cabin was warm in the July afternoon in the way of a house that has been lived in, genuinely and daily, by people who intend to keep living in it. Eugenia Whitmore looked at her daughter across the table and could not find the disappointment she had brought with her. She looked for it in the way people look for something they have misplaced, returning to the last place they were certain they'd had it. It was not there. What was there instead was something she did not have a ready word for, a woman who had settled into herself so completely that the settling looked permanent. Constance said very little. They left the following morning. Neither of them wrote to ask how Grace was getting on after that, and Grace did not write first. Caleb and Grace were married the third week of July in the Bitterroot Valley Church, with Cole the stage driver as witness and Doc Alderman from the pass standing in the second pew because he had heard there would be a celebration and was not ashamed to say so. The church was not full. The mountain did not require an audience. Grace Whitmore Marsh wore a dress she had made herself. Gray-blue wool, good cloth, cut to fit her own frame exactly as it was, which was broad and capable, and hers, and she walked down the aisle of that small church with the posture of a woman who has stopped waiting for the room to make up its mind about her. She had made up her own mind. That was sufficient. In the years that followed, the Marsh property in Bitterroot Valley became the thing it had always been in potential and never quite reached alone. The Souse field draining, properly from the second summer on, a kitchen garden that produced enough to put up stores for winter and trade some besides, a fence line that ran true from the east tree line to the creek and held through 3 hard winters without failing. Cole stopped in twice a year on his stage run and ate whatever was on the stove, and reported to anyone who asked in the valley below that the Marsh place was the kind of operation you could tell was being thought about by 2 people rather than 1. Grace Whitmore Marsh worked the land beside her husband for 41 years. She kept the accounts in a hand that was precise and unadorned. She could read a land survey and set a fence post and dress a wound and judge the morning sky, and she did all of these things without waiting to be recognized for them, which was the habit of a lifetime, and she kept the habit because it was efficient and because she had long since stopped needing the recognition from outside. She had been told her whole life that she was what was left over after the real value had been assigned elsewhere. She had come to a mountain in the mud season, and she had looked at it with clear eyes, and she had done the work that was in front of her, and she had let a man see her do it, and the man had said plainly and in front of witnesses that her work was the strongest on the line. "What we have to spare," her mother had written. She thought of that letter sometimes, not with bitterness. She had put that down in the kitchen chest and closed the lid on, but with the particular quiet satisfaction of a woman who knows that the people who appraised her did not have the instruments for it, and that the proof of this is the life she is living, daily and completely with both hands. She had been enough all along. She had simply needed to arrive somewhere that could tell the difference.